It began with the cold, oily steel of a .38 snub-nose revolver. There was no conversation, no warning, no demand to put hands in the air. There was only the deafening crash of a front door being kicked open, followed immediately by a sudden, suffocating silence. It was 2 a.m. in Harlem, 1952. Inside Vedder's Supper Club, the air was thick with smoke and cheap perfume, but in that moment, the entire world shrank down to the 6 feet of space between the most dangerous man in New York and the barrel of a gun. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in the corner booth. He didn't flinch. He didn't dive for cover. He was holding a small paring knife midway through peeling an orange, the juice running down his thumb. The jukebox was drowned out by the rising, high-pitched ring of tinnitus, and time itself seemed to slow to a crawl. The gunman was shaking, not from fear, but from the raw adrenaline of having the drop on the king. He held the contract of a lifetime. All he had to do was pull the trigger. Usually, the distance between a man and his maker is measured in years. But that night, in a dimly lit club in Harlem, it was measured in inches. Specifically, the 6 inches between that muzzle and Bumpy Johnson's face. Most men, in that fraction of a second, would close their eyes. Most men would pray. Bumpy Johnson did neither. The shot rang out, a cannon crack in the small room, but the bullet buried itself in the plaster wall, mere inches from Bumpy's ear. Because Bumpy didn't move away. He moved in. In a blur of motion that seemed to defy physics, Bumpy's left hand slapped the hot barrel aside, searing his palm while his right hand went to work. He didn't drop the fruit knife. He turned it into a paintbrush. It was violent, chaotic, and gritty, a flash of silver, a scream that curtailed into a wet gurgle. The gun clattered to the floor. Bumpy wasn't just fighting, he was dismantling. He drove the hitman back against the jukebox, causing the record to skip, violently. The hitman's hands flew up to his face, but he was too late. The knife flashed again, and again, and again. When the police finally arrived, the heavy rain was falling hard on the pavement outside. Inside, they found the hitman alive. He was screaming for mercy. He was screaming for his mother. But mostly, he was screaming because the world had gone dark. He had walked in to kill a legend, but he walked out with 36 stab wounds and eyes that would never see the sun again. And Bumpy Johnson? He simply sat back down, finished his drink, and waited for the cops. How does a man survive an assassination by walking into the bullet? And what kind of man leaves his enemy alive, but permanently in the dark, just to send a message? This is the story of the night Harlem stood still. To understand why a man would catch a bullet with his bare hands, you first have to understand the kingdom he was protecting. Harlem, 1950. To the city planners downtown, it was nothing more than a containment zone, a grid of red-lined maps where banks refused to lend a single dollar, and the police only entered to collect bribes or break heads. But to the people living inside it was Rome. It was the Vatican of Black America. The air here was different. It vibrated with the rumble of the elevated train and the brassy wail of saxophones practicing scales in tenement windows. It smelled of roasting peanuts, expensive tobacco, the exhaust fumes of Cadillacs that cost more than a house in Queens, and the heavy, humid weight of ambition. Walking through the center of this storm, parting the crowds like the Red Sea, was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. They called him the Professor. While the Italian mobsters in East Harlem were known for their hot tempers and loud threats, Bumpy was a creature of ice. He was a student of history, a man who had devoured Nietzsche and Machiavelli in the solitary confinement of Dannemora prison. He understood that in the underworld, violence is a tool, but intelligence is a weapon. In the quiet of the chess club, moving a knight with a manicured hand, he taught his soldiers the difference between checkers and the long game. He told them that while they were staring at the pawn in front of them, they were losing their queen. His philosophy was simple. Never watch the hand that's waving at you. Watch the hand that's in your pocket. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He was the unauthorized government of Harlem. In the 1950s, the legitimate financial system was a fortress with the gates locked against Black Americans. You couldn't get a mortgage. You couldn't get a business loan. So the community created its own economy, the numbers game, the policy. It was an illegal lottery, yes, but it was also the bank. Grandmothers played a nickel on a dream book number, and those profits funded grocery stores, funeral parlors, and college tuitions. And Bumpy Johnson sat on top of the vault. On the street, he was the patron saint of the block. Dressed in a charcoal gray double-breasted suit tailored to hide both his scars and the .32 caliber pistol against his ribs, he would stop for the weary women of the neighborhood. When Mrs. Wallace approached him, worn down by the crushing weight of the era, worried about her son's train fare to Howard University, Bumpy didn't hesitate. He didn't flash a roll of cash like a common thug. He palmed a folded stack of bills and slid it into her hand with the grace of a magician, discreet and dignified. He didn't ask for repayment. He only asked for a lawyer in the family, because he knew his people needed lawyers more than they needed soldiers. This was the Robin Hood myth. It was true. He paid rents. He bought coal in the winter. He was the hero of every barbershop story. But myths have a dark side. To be a sheepdog, you have to be able to kill the wolf. And sometimes you have to be scarier than the wolf. In the back rooms, where the air was thick with stale beer and aggression, the benevolent uncle disappeared. When a runner named Tiny was caught skimming, stealing just a few dollars here and there, Bumpy didn't scream. He didn't lose control. He simply took off his jacket and folded it neatly over a chair, caring more about the silk lining than the man bleeding in front of him. He picked up a heavy slate pool cue and explained the social contract. He explained that theft wasn't just about money, it was a rejection of his protection. And then came the sound, not a Hollywood effect, but the wet, dull thud of wood-cracking bone. He was a man of duality. He could discuss the poetry of Langston Hughes in the morning and break a man's legs by noon. He was respected, yes, but more importantly, he was feared. For 20 years, he had held the line against the encroaching white mob families who viewed Harlem as a cash cow to be milked. But by 1952, the world was shifting. The Italians were getting greedier, the police were getting hungrier, and Bumpy was getting older. Under the glow of a lighter flame, the stress lines around his eyes were deepening. The sharks could smell blood in the water. They looked at the professor and wondered if the poetry had made him soft. They were about to learn a very painful lesson. A man who reads history knows exactly how to repeat it. If Central Harlem was Bumpy's kingdom, Pleasant Avenue was the fortress of the enemy. By 1952, the uneasy truce between the black underworld and the Italian Mafia, specifically the Genovese crime family, was beginning to fray like an old rope under too much tension. Historically, the arrangement was simple. The Italians imported the heroin and controlled the unions, while the black gangsters ran the policy banks, the numbers. It was a segregation of sin, but greed is a universal language, and the Italians were fluent in it. Inside the rear of an Italian social club, thick with cigar smoke and the bitter aroma of espresso, the patience of the mob was wearing thin. Men like Capo Sally D'Amico sat around tables covered in red and white checkered cloth, wiping tomato sauce from their plates with crusty bread, fuming not about the money, but about the attitude. To them, Bumpy Johnson didn't act like a partner, he acted like he was doing them a favor. He walked down 125th Street like he was the mayor. The psychological profile of Bumpy's enemies was complex. It wasn't just business, it was deeply personal. Men like D'Amico grew up believing in a strict hierarchy. In their world, they were the Roman Empire, and everyone else was a barbarian. To see a black man, a man they viewed as inferior, outsmarting them, outdressing them, and out-earning them, was an insult to their very existence. Racism in the underworld wasn't burning crosses on lawns, it was squeezed margins and protection taxes that only went one way. So the decision was made. The commission was squeezing the docks and they needed new revenue. They decided to raise the protection fee on Harlem to 40%. They knew Bumpy would never agree to it. That was the point. They planned to replace him with a puppet, some hungry kid from Harlem who would kill his own mother for a shot at the title. The Italians stopped viewing Bumpy as a partner and started viewing him as an obstacle. They didn't understand that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a man holding a position, he was the position. But the threat wasn't just external. As is the case with all empires, the rot started from within. Inside the blue velvet lounge, amidst the smoke and jazz, sat Flash. Every king has a Flash, the ambitious lieutenant who thinks the crown is just a hat you can pick up and wear. Flash looked at Bumpy and didn't see a legend. He saw an old man. He saw a barrier. He saw a dinosaur who quoted philosophy when he should be counting profits. Sipping champagne he couldn't afford, Flash whispered to anyone who would listen that the old man was losing his touch, that he was too soft, too worried about feeding widows instead of feeding the crew. Flash was the perfect tool for the Italians. He was blinded by envy. He didn't see the glass ceiling, he only saw the ladder. He didn't realize that to the mob, he was just as disposable as the wrapper on a pack of cigarettes. Bumpy, however, was awake. He was always awake. Standing by the window of his apartment at dawn, looking out at the gray Harlem skyline, he sensed the shift. You don't survive 20 years in the life without developing a sixth sense for betrayal. He noticed the small things. A runner short on his weekly drop, a nod from a police sergeant that was a fraction of a second too brief, the way conversation died when he entered a room. These were the tremors before the earthquake. When the phone finally rang, a jarring mechanical sound in the quiet apartment, Bumpy was ready. The voice on the other end was distorted, delivering a coded message. "The price of flour just went up, Professor. The bakery wants 40%. The bakery was the Genovese family. The flour was the heroin trade. Bumpy's face didn't move. His pulse didn't rise. He simply told them that his contract was fixed, and if they wanted to renegotiate, they should send a representative. But to make sure, he wore a comfortable suit because it might be a long meeting. He hung up. He knew what it meant. Most men would have packed a bag and run to the Caribbean. Bumpy walked to his closet and took out his best suit, a midnight blue sharkskin, and a tie with a splash of red. "If they want a war," he whispered to the empty room, "let's give them a war they can write about." The Italians sent a probe first. A black sedan pulled up to a number spot, and soldiers bullied a young kid, slapping him hard, declaring the spot closed unless the new tax was paid. It was a test of defenses. They wanted to see if Bumpy would retaliate or negotiate. Bumpy didn't negotiate with bullies. Later that afternoon, that same black sedan was found parked on 110th Street. The tires were slashed, the windows were smashed, and sitting on the driver's seat was a single peeled orange. No note, no threat, just the signature. When Sally D'Amico heard about the fruit, he turned red. He thought Bumpy was mocking them, but his advisor knew better. It was a symbol. It meant Bumpy could get to them anywhere. It meant he had been inside the car. The die was cast. The Italians realized they couldn't scare Bumpy Johnson. They couldn't tax him, and they couldn't control him. So the logic of the underworld kicked in. If you can't control the king, you kill him. But they needed a way in. They needed a key to the back door, and that key was currently sitting in the blue velvet lounge, waiting for his chance to shine. The conspiracy was born, the money was moved, and the hitman was called. August 1952. The heat in New York was oppressive, the kind of heat that stuck your shirt to your back, distorted the streetlights in shimmering waves, and made tempers snap like dry twigs. But for Bumpy Johnson, the rising temperature wasn't about the weather. It was about the silence. In the underworld, noise is normal. Threats, arguments, sirens, that's the background hum of the city. But when the streets go quiet, when the people who usually wave at you suddenly find something interesting to look at on the ground, that's when you know the contract has been signed. Paranoia is the tax you pay for power. Inside his Packard, moving through the claustrophobic night, Bumpy watched the side mirror with calculating eyes. He had stopped sleeping in the same bed 2 nights in a row. He stopped eating food he didn't see prepared. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine walking through your own kingdom, smiling at your subjects, while constantly calculating the trajectory of a bullet from every rooftop. When he ordered his driver, Tiny, to take a sudden illogical turn to avoid a tail, he wasn't just being cautious. He was surviving. As the tires squealed and the heavy car swung around, Bumpy watched a gray Ford sedan continue straight, a car that had been trailing them for 6 blocks. Predictability, he exhaled through a cloud of smoke, is a death sentence. He was seeing ghosts in every shadow. And the worst part? The ghosts were real. The Italians had put a $50,000 bounty on his head. In 1952, that was enough to buy a block of brownstones. It was enough to make a loyal man question his allegiance. It was enough to make a brother turn on a brother. This is the side of the gangster life the movies don't show: the isolation. Inside a sparse safe house with Venetian blinds casting prison bars of shadow across the room, Bumpy sat alone. He couldn't confide in his wife, Mamie. He couldn't tell her that he checked the ignition of his car every morning for wire. He couldn't tell his lieutenants that he suspected one of them was leaking his schedule. He sat with a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince in his lap and a loaded pistol on the table. When a siren passed outside, he didn't panic, but his hand was on the gun before the sound even faded. He was playing a game of chess where the pieces were invisible, and the board was the entire city of New York. He began to test his circle, feeding false information to his lieutenants to see where the black sedans showed up. He was tightening the circle, but a tight circle can easily become a noose. The walls began to close in from all sides. In a diner, a nervous young messenger delivered the news that the police had raided the counting house. The corrupt detectives, on Bumpy's payroll for years, were suddenly under new management. The Italians were squeezing the police to squeeze Bumpy. Externally, Bumpy projected absolute stoic discipline. "They took the paper, son," he said calmly, wiping his mouth. "They didn't take the people." But inside, he knew the clock was ticking. The raids were harassment designed to make him desperate. They wanted him to panic. They wanted him to make a mistake. And Bumpy Johnson hated making mistakes. By September, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Standing before a map of Harlem, tired and worn, Bumpy made a decision. He wouldn't hide. Hiding was an admission of defeat. If he went underground, the Italians won. If he showed fear, his own men would lose respect. So he did the most dangerous thing imaginable. He walked right into the spotlight. He started going to Vedder's Supper Club, alone, at the same time every night. It was a dare. It was a challenge thrown down to the universe. Come and get me. He knew they were watching. He knew the traitor, whoever it was, would make the call. He was counting on it. He was setting himself up as the bait in his own trap. But the problem with being bait is that sometimes the shark swallows you whole before the trap can spring. We are deep in the danger zone now. The trap is set, and the hunter is about to become the hunted. This story is long and dark, and I appreciate you riding with me this far. Quick check-in. What time is it where you are watching this? Are you watching this late at night with the lights off? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Betrayal is rarely a loud event. It doesn't arrive with a scream, but in whispers. It happens in the quiet, suffocating exchange of an envelope in the front seat of a Buick, parked beneath the heavy steel structure of the elevated train tracks, where the exhaust plume turns red in the brake lights. The setup was classic, simple, brutal. The Italians knew they couldn't get close to Bumpy directly. His inner circle was too tight, his bodyguards too loyal. To get to the king, they needed a key. And that key was Flash, the ambitious lieutenant who thought the crown was just a hat he could pick up and wear. Inside the idling car, the air was thick with trepidation. Flash sat sweating, despite the cool night. While beside him, an Italian associate named Vinny sat calmly peeling a hangnail, treating the sale of a man's life like a grocery list. Flash gave up the time. 2 a.m. He gave up the place, Vedder's, and he gave up the most crucial detail of all. The security was gone. He had told Red to take the night off, claiming the boss wanted a private sit-down with a city councilman. Flash didn't just sell out his boss, he sold out a father figure. And for what? A heavy brown paper bag filled with bills that would be gone in a month. Vinny handed it over with a piece of cold advice. Go to Jersey until the smoke clears. Flash took the money, unaware he was signing his own death warrant. In this life, nobody trusts a traitor, not even the buyer. The Italians didn't send one of their own to pull the trigger. They outsourced the job to a freelancer, a mechanic from out of town with no name in the history books, just a description: heavy coat, dead eyes, steady hands, in a cheap hotel room, lit by the incessant buzz of a neon sign. He loaded a .38 snub-nose with hollow point rounds. Click, click, click. He didn't hate Bumpy Johnson. He didn't even know him. To him, the King of Harlem was just an address. This is the terrifying banality of evil. It was just a job. At 1:45 a.m., Vedder's Supper Club was winding down. The bartender, Betty, was wiping the counter. Bumpy sat alone in his booth, enveloped in the cozy, warm atmosphere, the illusion of safety that kills you. He had sent his driver to wash the car. He had sent his bodyguard home. It was a rare lapse in judgment, or perhaps arrogance, the belief that the legend was untouchable. He ordered a coffee and a fruit plate, pulling out his small silver pocket knife to peel an orange. The sound of the knife slicing the rind, shh, was distinct and sharp in the quiet room. But outside, the predator had arrived. The hitman stood in the shadows, rain lashing against his trench coat, looking through the glass. He saw the target, relaxed, distracted. He took a breath, felt the weight of the steel in his pocket, and pushed the door open. The bell above the door jingled. Ding. Bumpy paused. The orange rind hung from his thumb. He didn't look up immediately, but his body went rigid. These were the sensory details Bumpy would remember for the rest of his life. The smell of floor wax, the taste of coffee, the sound of the rain suddenly getting louder as the door opened, and the shift in air pressure. The primitive brain knows when a predator has entered the cave. The hair on Bumpy's arms stood up. Red wasn't there. Tiny wasn't there. Why was the door opening? He lifted his head. He saw the wet coat. He saw the hand moving. It takes half a second for the human brain to process a visual threat and another fraction to signal the muscles to move. Bumpy Johnson had less than a second to rewrite history. The gun came up. The eyes met. And the silence of the room was about to be shattered forever. In the history of violence, there's a concept called the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. The man who cycles through this loop faster wins. The man who hesitates dies. At 1:56 a.m., inside Vedder's Supper Club, the air was thick with dust and neon. The hitman had the gun. He had the surprise. But he made one fatal error. He expected Bumpy Johnson to be a victim. He expected a man who would freeze. He didn't know he was stepping into a cage with a wounded tiger. The gunshot was deafening, a crack that sounded like the sky tearing open. But Bumpy was already gone. In a move that defied his age, he didn't recoil. He attacked. He kicked the heavy oak table upward, slamming the edge into the gunman's knees just as the hammer fell. The barrel jerked, and the bullet smashed into the mirror behind the booth, raining glass down like a shower of diamonds. Bumpy roared, a sound of pure, primal aggression. He launched himself over the overturned table, a blur of gray soot and fury, crashing the gunman back against the jukebox. The revolver skittered across the linoleum, spinning away into the darkness. This wasn't a movie fight. There was no kung fu, no choreography. It was just two men trying to murder each other in a phone booth. The hitman, younger and stronger, threw a wild hook that snapped Bumpy's head back, spraying blood from his lip. He reached for his boot, for a switchblade. But Bumpy had something the hitman didn't. He had the fruit knife. A tiny wooden-handled tool meant for apples and oranges. Bumpy didn't slash. He stabbed. He pinned the man's arm to the jukebox with the first strike. The hitman screamed, a high, wet sound begging for release. But Bumpy just gritted his teeth, blood dripping from his chin. The look in his eyes asked the question before his lips did. You came for the king? You came for me? What happened next is difficult to describe without flinching. It was the unleashing of 20 years of repressed rage. Every prison beatdown, every police raid, every moment of disrespect Bumpy had ever swallowed. His arm became a piston. He wasn't aiming, he was overwhelming. The chest, the neck, the hands trying to block the blade. The jukebox, damaged by the impact, began to skip violently, distorting the music into a demonic loop. Harlem. 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 The hitman slumped, sobbing, bleeding from a dozen wounds. Most men would have stopped there. The threat was neutralized. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. He grabbed the hitman by the lapels and slammed him back up against the glass. He demanded the man open his eyes. He wanted the last thing this man saw to be the face of Bumpy Johnson. And then came the twist. The moment that turned a gangland fight into a horror story. Bumpy didn't go for the heart. He raised that small knife to the man's face. With a precise, deliberate slash, he took the man's sight. The scream that followed wasn't just pain, it was the terrified realization of eternal darkness. When the violence stopped, the only sound left was the rain hammering against the window and the whimpering on the floor. Bumpy stood there, panting, his suit ruined, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump. He looked over at Betty, the bartender cowering in the corner. His voice was raspy but steady. He didn't ask for a doctor. He didn't ask for the police. He just told her to turn off the damn jukebox because it was skipping. 36 wounds. That would be the count later. Bumpy looked down at the man writhing on the floor, a man who would never see his children or the sunrise ever again. He gave him a message to carry back to the bosses. He told him to tell them that Bumpy Johnson sends his regards. He told them that next time they sent a wolf, he would send back a head. Bumpy straightened his tie. He picked up his fedora, placed it on his head, tilting it just so. And then he walked out the door, stepping over the shattered glass and into the Harlem night, leaving the blood and the darkness behind him. The loudest sound in the world isn't a gunshot, it isn't a scream. The loudest sound in the world is the silence that follows. For 10 seconds inside Vedder's supper club, nobody moved. The air smelled of sulfur, the metallic tang of fresh blood, and the sour scent of fear. Bumpy Johnson was gone, vanished into the rain like a ghost, but he had left his masterpiece behind. Betty, the bartender, finally stood up from behind the mahogany rail. She reached for the phone to call the cleaner, but when she saw the man on the floor, when she saw his eyes, she put the receiver down. This wasn't something you could just mop up. Outside, on 116th Street, the rain was washing the blood from Bumpy's suit, swirling it pink into the gutters. He moved fast, rounding the corner to where his Packard was idling. His men, tiny and red, were frantic. They had heard the shots. They saw the blood on his shirt and assumed the worst. Bumpy held up a hand to stop them. That hand was trembling, just slightly. The adrenaline dump was hitting him now, the crash after the high. He leaned against the cold metal of the car, gasping for air, and told them, "It's not my blood." He slid into the leather sanctuary of the back seat and closed his eyes. As the car pulled away, merging into the dark traffic, Red turned around. He asked the question that any soldier would ask. "Did you finish him?" In the underworld, the rule is simple. Dead men tell no tales. Red expected a corpse. Bumpy lit a cigarette, the flame illuminating the hard lines of his face. "No," he said, "he's alive." Red was shocked. A witness left alive could talk to the cops. But Bumpy shook his head. He knew the hitman wouldn't talk to anyone about what he saw because he hadn't seen anything. And he never would again. "I took his future," Bumpy said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "If I killed him, Red, they would bury him on Sunday and forget him by Monday. A dead man is a tragedy. But a blind man? A blind man walking around Harlem with scars on his face? That's a billboard. That's a walking advertisement." It was a cold, calculated decision. It wasn't mercy. It was strategic cruelty. Bumpy knew that every time an enemy soldier saw that man tapping his cane down the street, they would think of Bumpy Johnson. They would remember the price of missing. Sometimes, Bumpy mused, death is too easy. You have to let them live with their mistake. Back at the club, the police screeched to a halt. Blue and red lights flashed against the wet pavement. They found the hitman, but he refused to give a name. He just kept repeating, "The dark, the dark." The code of silence held firm, even in agony. But the detective on the scene, a man who had chased Bumpy for years, didn't need a confession. He looked at the table and saw the orange peel. Perfect, unbroken. He told the rookie not to bother dusting for prints. They knew who had been there. Bumpy had turned the crime scene into a statement. He hadn't just survived, he had dominated. But back in the car, as the adrenaline faded, Bumpy finally looked at his own wounds, a cracked rib, a deep bruise. He touched the spot where the bullet had missed him by inches. He whispered to himself, "Too close." He knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. The veil was pierced. Tonight, he had won the battle, but the war had just begun. This brings us to a moment that divides people. Bumpy chose to leave the man alive, blinded and scarred, to serve as a living warning to his enemies. I want to know where you stand on this. If you were in his shoes and your brother tried to kill you, would you have let him live to send a message? Or would you have ended it right there? Comment yes if you would show mercy, even cruel mercy, or no if you would have finished the job. Let's argue it out in the comments. In the underworld, there is a distinct difference between reacting and responding. Amateurs react, they get angry, they shout, they shoot wildly in the street. Professionals respond, they wait, they calculate, and then they dismantle you piece by piece. For 3 days, Harlem held its breath. The streets were quiet. The numbers banks were closed. Everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop, expecting a war, expecting bodies in the street. But Bumpy Johnson was playing chess, not checkers. Inside his apartment, nursing cracked ribs that would have killed a weaker man, Bumpy dismissed the concept of luck. When the doctor told him he was lucky to be alive, Bumpy corrected him. Luck is for fools, Doc. It was preparation. The moment the doctor left, Red stepped out of the shadows. They had found him. Flash, the young lieutenant who sold out the king for a bag of cash. He thought he was safe across the river in a motel in Jersey. He thought the state line was a magic shield. He forgot that Bumpy's reach didn't stop at the Hudson. Justice in the 1950s underworld was not a jury of your peers. It was a summary judgment. That night, in a desolate stretch of New Jersey marshland where the wind howls a lonely, mournful sound, Flash was on his knees. He was wearing the expensive suit he bought with the betrayal money, now ruined by mud and fear. He begged, he pleaded, he claimed they forced him. Bumpy stood over him, leaning on a cane, looking not angry, but disappointed, like a father whose son had failed a test that couldn't be retaken. A man who sells his loyalty once will sell it again, Bumpy said. Inflation is a terrible thing, Flash. He turned his back and walked toward the car. He didn't watch. He simply told Red, "Close the account." There was no dramatic music, just the wind, the distant honk of a tugboat, and a single, muffled thud. Flash was found a week later with no note, just the king of spades in his pocket. The house was clean. Now it was time to deal with the neighbors. Bumpy walked into the private room of the Italian restaurant alone. It was a power move, walking into the lion's den with nothing but a glass of water and the truth. When the guards reached for their jackets, Bumpy's voice filled the room. "Relax, gentlemen. If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have heard the door open." He sat opposite Sally D'Amico, the boss who ordered the hit. Sally looked tired, like a man who had bet the house on a horse with a broken leg. Bumpy didn't waste time. He laid out the reality. Sally had tried to retire him and missed. Now there was a blind man wandering the streets, a living billboard of Sally's failure. "That's embarrassing for you, Sal," Bumpy said. "It looks weak." Sally turned purple, but he didn't strike. He knew the commission hated sloppy work. Bumpy dictated the new terms. The protection payments stayed flat, and the heroin on 116th Street stopped. Today. When Sally hesitated, Bumpy leaned in, his eyes dark pools of history. "The next time I peel an orange, Sal, I'll be sitting in your living room." The threat hung in the air, heavy as lead. Sally was a killer, but he was a businessman first. War would cost millions. His hand shook for a microsecond as he picked up his espresso. "The price stays," he said. "For now." Bumpy walked out victorious. He had stared down the mob and made them blink, but back in the safety of his car, the mask dropped. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath. He looked out the window at the Harlem streets, the kids playing, the women shopping, and he felt separated from them, as if he were behind glass. The assassination attempt had changed him. The humor was gone. The professor who quoted poetry faded away, and the Godfather took over completely. He realized that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. He fortified his empire not with love, but with fear. The 36 stab wounds hadn't just been inflicted on the hitman, they were inflicted on Bumpy's soul. He had crossed a line that night. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had handed him a knife. We are nearing the end of the legend. We've seen the violence, and we've seen the revenge. But what is the legacy of a man like this? If you're still watching, type "The King" in the comments. It helps the video find other history buffs like you. Let's see how strong the Bumpy Johnson army is tonight. Time is the one assassin that never misses. That night at Vedder's Supper Club bought Bumpy Johnson another 15 years of silence. It solidified his myth. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a ghost story that mothers told their sons to keep them off the corners. But while Bumpy stood still, the world around him was burning. By the mid-1960s, the gentleman gangster was a dinosaur walking through the Ice Age. The code of silence was being replaced by the scream of the heroin epidemic. The Italians had opened the floodgates. Heroin wasn't just a sideline business anymore. It was the main artery of the underworld. Bumpy tried to control it. He tried to keep it away from the schools, to regulate the chaos. But you can't regulate a plague. He found himself fighting a war on two fronts. On one side, the Genovese family, who wanted total control. On the other, the young Superfly generation of dealers who didn't respect the old hierarchy. But even in his twilight, Bumpy had one last unexpected role to play. History makes strange bedfellows. Bumpy Johnson, the king of the underworld, and Malcolm X, the prince of the Nation of Islam. They knew each other from the streets of the 40s when Malcolm was still Detroit Red. When Malcolm split from the nation and his life was in danger, the police wouldn't protect him. But Bumpy would. In a quiet room, Bumpy made the offer. "You're walking around with a target on your back, Red. Let my boys stand outside, just until the heat dies down." When Malcolm hesitated, citing his new direction, Bumpy was blunt. "A dead man can't build anything. Take the protection." For a brief window, the most dangerous gangsters in Harlem stood guard over the most important civil rights leader in America. It was a collision of two worlds, the sacred and the profane, united by the reality of violence. But eventually, Malcolm sent them away. He chose his path. And we all know how that story ended. Then came July 7th, 1968. Inside Wells Restaurant, a famous Harlem establishment, Bumpy was eating with his childhood friend, Junie Bird. It was 2 a.m., the same time as the assassination attempt years ago. He was laughing. It was a rare sight. The end didn't come with a bang. It didn't come with a knife in the dark. Bumpy Johnson had survived shootouts, prison riots, and 36 stab wounds. He had outlived Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano, and the Kennedys. He was eating a chicken leg. He was drinking coffee. And then he stopped. He touched his chest. His face didn't show fear. It showed surprise. "Junie," he whispered, "I think the bill is due." He clutched his chest and fell. There was no hitman, no Italian soldier, just a heart that had beaten too hard for too long against a world that wanted it to stop. He died in the arms of his friend, on the floor of a diner, surrounded by the people of Harlem. When Caesar died, Rome burned. When Bumpy died, Harlem broke. Thousands lined the streets for the funeral. It looked like a state affair, men crying, women fainting. With the king gone, the structure collapsed. The Pax Johnson was over. The Italians moved in with full force, and the young wolves tore each other apart for the scraps. The heroin epidemic exploded into a wildfire that would consume the city for the next 2 decades. The incident at Vedder's Supper Club was the defining moment of his life because it proved he was unbreakable. But his death proved something else, that institutions are fragile. Bumpy was the dam holding back the flood. And when the dam broke, everyone drowned. He was the last of the old guard, the last man who believed that even in crime, there could be honor. Bumpy Johnson walked a fine line between villain and hero. To the FBI, he was a monster. To Harlem, he was a savior. I want to know your verdict. Was Bumpy Johnson a necessary evil who protected his community, or just another criminal who poisoned it? Vote in the poll in the corner of the video right now, or leave your thoughts in the comments. They say that in Harlem, the pavement remembers everything, every drop of blood, every secret deal, every prayer whispered in the dark. We stand here tonight, 70 years later, looking at a building that is just brick and mortar now, a discount store under the glow of LED streetlights. But if you listen closely, past the sirens, past the traffic, past the noise of the modern world, you can still hear the echo of that gunshot. You can still hear the silence that followed. The story of Bumpy Johnson and the blind hitman is more than just a gangland anecdote. is a parable. It asks a fundamental question about power. What is the cost of being the king? Bumpy Johnson walked out of this building that night with his life. He survived the bullet. He survived the knife. But he left a piece of his humanity on that floor, right next to the hitman's eyes. To be the professor, Bumpy had to harden his heart until it was as cold as the steel he carried. He had to decide that mutilating a man was a better business decision than killing him. That is a terrifying kind of arithmetic. We look back at these men, Bumpy, Luciano, Costello, with a mix of horror and fascination. We call them legends. We make movies about them. We romanticize the suits and the cars. But we forget the fear. The 36 stab wounds were not a fight. They were a signature. They were a message written in the only language the underworld understands: brutality. Bumpy Johnson stood as a dam against the flood for 40 years. He kept the Italian mob at bay. He demanded respect. In an era that tried to strip black men of their dignity, he was a warrior for his tribe. But when you live by the sword, you don't just die by the sword. You die alone. Today, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson lies in Woodlawn Cemetery. The Godfather of Harlem rests in dignity. But the hitman, no one knows his name. He vanished into the darkness Bumpy created for him. He became a ghost story, a warning whispered in pool halls and back alleys. Don't miss. Whatever you do, don't miss. The era of the gentleman gangster is dead. The code of silence is broken. The streets are louder now, faster, more chaotic. But on rainy nights in Harlem, when the shadows stretch long down 125th Street, some people swear they can still see a figure in a trench coat, peeling an orange with a silver knife, watching over his city, waiting for someone to break the rules. History is written by the victors, but the truth is kept by the survivors. I hope you felt the weight of that truth tonight. I hope you felt the cold air of 1952. We have reached the end of the file, but the archives are deep, and there are many more bodies buried in the history books. I want to know, where are you watching this from right now? What is the weather like outside your window? Is it raining? And if you want to be the first to hear the next untold story of the American underworld, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell. The streets are talking, and we are listening. Until next time, keep your eyes open.